Let us free ourselves from the snares of earthly things, we spirits who crave our heavenly home. Let us fly with Platonic wings and God's guidance to the celestial throne, where we shall contemplate the excellence of our kind. So, let's put on our Platonic wings, ascend upwards, and contemplate, as always in these videos, a few excellent and remarkable members of the human species. Hello and welcome. I'm Ross King. That was Marsilio Ficino. And today I want to talk to you about the Renaissance discovery or rediscovery of Plato, something in which Ficino, as we'll see, played a vital role. Now, it might come as a surprise that Plato needed to be rediscovered, or that he'd ever been lost in the first place. After all, the Encyclopedia Britannica calls him the author of philosophical works of unparalleled influence. And in 1927, the English philosopher A.N. Whitehead said, "The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato." But it wasn't always so. For many centuries, Plato was a shadowy presence in European philosophy and culture. His legacy in the European Middle Ages was very different from, for example, that of Aristotle, because Aristotle was read and appreciated by scholars and writers in Europe long before Plato got any traction. We always think of Plato and Aristotle together, like conjoined twins, a kind of philosophical double act, the twin towers of Western philosophy, which is basically how Raphael portrays them in the School of Athens, which he painted in the Vatican in about 1510. That's natural and logical. Their lives were bound up together. Aristotle studied with Plato. Plato was the teacher with whom he began to study in 367 BC when he was 17 and Plato about 60. And Aristotle remained with him in the academy, Plato's philosophy school, for some 20 years. But as the centuries passed, the pair became detached from one another, with Aristotle rising to the top and Plato slowly disappearing from view, sometimes regarded as a dangerous figure who could threaten Western civilization, only to be dramatically rediscovered in the West in the 1400s in Florence at the height of what we call the Renaissance. Knowledge is a precarious and perishable commodity. It makes dangerous and uncertain voyages across space, through time, and in the pages of fragile manuscripts or on papyrus scrolls that, written in ancient languages, are often difficult to read when scholars find them many centuries later. Let me say a few words first of all and briefly about the rediscovery of Aristotle in the West and how his works navigated the treacherous waters of time. All of his works, along with many other Greek treatises, have been translated into classical Arabic in the 700s and 800s AD. Many translations were made in Baghdad under the reign of the Caliph al-Ma'mun and his successors, thanks to scholars such as Al-Kindi, who lived in the 9th century. Many of these ancient Greek texts, including those of Aristotle, were then transferred to Western Europe in the course of the centuries by and for the Muslims or Moors living in the Iberian Peninsula. Here they were studied and enlarged upon by scholars and philosophers, especially one from Cordoba in southern Spain named Ibn Rushd, who is known to Europeans as Averroes. Aristotle's prominence in the Latin and Christian West increased when, in 1085, Alfonso VI, King of Castile and Leon, aka Alfonso the Brave, conquered Toledo and took its magnificent library from Muslim into Christian possession. An important school of translators emerged in Toledo in the century that followed. This international team of scholars turned the Aristotelian and other Greek manuscripts in the library from Arabic into Latin. Aristotle was therefore the beneficiary of a great Arabic to Latin changeover at this time, a changeover that made his work much more available in the West. By 1200, almost all of Aristotle's works had been translated into Latin, and by the middle of the 1200s, they were being taught at European universities, all of them very new, in Bologna, Oxford, Cambridge, Paris, and Toulouse. Any theological misgivings about reconciling pagan philosophy with revealed religion, and there certainly were a few qualms, a number of efforts had been made and edicts passed in the first half of the 1200s, trying to prevent the teaching of Aristotle in the universities. But most of these condemnations were blissfully ignored, and the theological wobbles and panics were eventually calmed by the great Dominican theologian Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas enlisted Aristotle to provide firm philosophical underpinnings for various Christian doctrines, for arguments about the nature of the soul, the mystery of the Trinity, and the existence of angels. The result was that Aristotle achieved enormous intellectual authority in the West. In 1305, the poet Dante called him the supreme philosopher, and he said that Aristotle's doctrines may almost be called universal opinion. So Aristotle became an almost unimpeachable authority, the backbone of European university education, and one of the great bulwarks of Christianity. But what about Plato? Plato did not come to the Latin West via the same route as Aristotle, i.e., through the Islamic world. The Islamic scholars of the Middle Ages considered him a great philosopher and sage. They called him the divine Plato, and references to him in their work certainly show knowledge of his work. However, the Islamic scholars of the Middle Ages really preferred Aristotle for his science, for his logic, for his qualitative knowledge. The translation of Plato's work into Arabic proceeded only very fitfully. Only a small handful of his works was ever translated into Arabic. There was never, for example, any concerted effort at a complete translation of the dialogues, and as a consequence, his works were not nearly as well known or used in the Islamic world as those of Aristotle. Plato was an even bigger blank in the Latin West. He was never completely forgotten in the Christian world following the fall of the Roman Empire in the West in 476 AD, but throughout the Middle Ages, he was comparatively absent and elusive. None of his works, for example, was taught in the Aristotle crazy universities of the 1200s and 1300s. One reason for this Plato gap is that his works were simply not available in the West. Plato left behind 36 dialogues, but as late as 1400, scholars in the West had access to complete translations of only two of them, the Meno and the Phaedo, translated very badly at that, and fragmentary translations of another two, the Timaeus and Parmenides. So that's four works, not all of them complete, from a total output of 36. Diligent scholars could try to piece together Plato's philosophy from various ancient sources that they did have, such as the works of Cicero, who, like all educated Romans, had been fluent in Greek, who frequently cited and discussed Plato, and who, living in the 1st century BC, had access to all of his works, as did, some 2 centuries later, Apuleius, and a few centuries after that, Boethius. Medieval scholars also had the works of Aristotle, because in many of his works, especially the metaphysics, the ethics, and the politics, he gives Plato's opinions on various topics, albeit often to try to refute them, and as such he sometimes misrepresents Plato's arguments. But this really was just a kind of patchwork Plato, a Plato who was glimpsed only briefly in faint glimmers and at second hand. So where was Plato hiding out? Where could you find his work in the Middle Ages? The answer was in the Byzantine Empire, especially Constantinople, the city founded by the Emperor Constantine in the year 330 on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium. Constantinople was a great repository of Greek culture, not least because the local population still spoke Greek. In the Middle Ages, scholars in Constantinople had embarked on a quest to retrieve and preserve the classics of ancient Greece. And in fact, virtually all of the Greek classics as we know them today have come down to us thanks to Byzantine manuscripts copied by scribes in the 9th and 10th centuries during the period that's sometimes called the Macedonian Renaissance. And so the medieval Byzantines possessed all 36 of Plato's dialogues, and they were written, of course, in a language the Byzantines spoke and read. However, Plato was not championed in the Byzantine world despite this availability of his works. This was mainly due to the hostility of Greek Christianity towards pagan philosophy. In 529 AD, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian the Great closed the Academy of Athens, the school founded by Plato 916 years earlier and active almost continuously since. Justinian forbade the teaching of pagan philosophy in order to put a stop to what he called the folly of the Greeks, by which he meant the ancient Greeks, the pagan writers. Now, of course, it's easy to exaggerate the importance of this closure, and pagan Greek philosophy, in fact, was not completely uprooted from the Byzantine world, as the Macedonian Renaissance clearly attests. So, for example, the philosopher Stephen of Alexandria gave lectures on Plato at the imperial court in Constantinople in the early 7th century. However, the ground was not as fertile as might have been expected given the largely favorable circumstances for Platonic study. Now, a few of these Greek manuscripts from Constantinople occasionally filtered through to the West. In the middle of the 1300s, Petrarch owned the first substantial collection of Plato's dialogues to arrive in the West. He had a manuscript, which still exists today, containing about half of them, a manuscript that came to him from Constantinople, a work that dates from the second half of the 9th century, i.e., from the time of the Macedonian Renaissance. Petrarch was eager to study his precious manuscript because of Plato's reputation. More men praise Aristotle, he wrote, but the better ones praise Plato. There was a big problem, though. Petrarch couldn't read Greek. In fact, almost no one could read Greek in the West at this time, or at least not ancient Greek to the level necessary to make sense of Plato. When scribes came across a word or phrase in Greek, as they often did because a writer like Cicero was constantly quoting Greek texts, if they came across one of these phrases, they would write in the margin, Grecum est non legitur, i.e., it's Greek to me. Petrarch made a number of valiant efforts to learn Greek, taking lessons from monks and scholars who came from Calabria in southern Italy, where Greek, or at least a dialect of Greek, had survived into the Middle Ages. But Petrarch was extremely limited in his success. Alas, I am deaf to you, and you are mute to me, he sighed over his Greek manuscripts. But a generation after Petrarch, who died in 1374, a skilled and resourceful teacher at last arrived, an expert in Greek who could instruct the Italians. He arrived in Florence on February the 2nd, 1397. Remember that date, it's epoch making. If we want to be old fashioned or over dramatic and try to find a date in history when everything changes, well, we could do worse than this one. So, who was this miraculous teacher? He was Manuel Chrysoloras, a Byzantine aristocrat from Constantinople. He originally came to Italy on an embassy from the Byzantine Empire in the mid 1390s, to try to drum up support in the West for a military expedition against the Ottoman Turks who were threatening Constantinople. The Florentines weren't much interested in doing battle against the Turks, but Chrysololus's knowledge of Greek appealed to them. The chancellor of Florence, i.e., the highest ranking public official in Florence, a man named Coluccio Salutati, wrote a letter to Chrysoloras saying the Florentines had the greatest reverence for learning and knowledge and now wished to add Greek scholarship to their accomplishments. So Chrysoloras was hired to teach Greek at the local university in Florence, and he also worked on translations. For example, he translated Plato's Republic into Latin, the first such attempt that had ever been made. But also, maybe even more important in the long term, he compiled a Greek grammar, the Erotomata, a title that means questions, a work that could be used by teachers in Greek instruction long after Chrysoloras left town. Over the next decade or so, Chrysoloras and his students translated 21 of Plato's dialogues, whichever ones they could get their hands on, and Florence soon became what one of these students, Leonardo Bruni, called the new Athens on the Arno. Bruni was probably Chrysoloras' most adept student. He would go on to become a brilliant scholar, writer, and politician. He cut his teeth translating Plato from Greek into Latin. He did this for the Gorgias, the Crito, and the Phaedrus. He also produced a new and superior translation of the Phaedo, which had been translated in the Middle Ages. But there was a problem. After a few years, Bruni stopped his work on Plato, turning away in revulsion, and in fact, turning to Aristotle translations instead. This abandonment of Plato might have been unexpected for those who'd followed Bruni's earlier translations. In 1409, he wrote in the preface to his translation of the Gorgias that the writings of Plato appear in conformity with our faith. In other words, Plato's writings tallied with Christianity, and Bruni dedicated this translation to, of all people, the Pope. Likewise, a few years earlier, when Bruni translated the Phaedo, also dedicated to a pope, a different one, he pointedly entitled it De Immortalitate Animae, because it offered, he believed, a sophisticated argument for the immortality of the soul. In other words, Plato's philosophical argument about the soul was in harmony with Christian thinking. Bruni wrote, on moral matters, Plato's teachings are so sound and beautiful that whenever I read his works, I imagine myself hearing Peter or Paul handing down the rules for virtuous life. Now, such claims for Plato had been made before, most emphatically by someone with even more authority than Bruni, i.e., by St. Augustine, one of the fathers of the church, whose enormous contribution to Christianity was his strategic alignment of Christian teaching with classical thought, especially with Platonism. Augustine wished to emphasize a continuity between the undeniable greatness of the Roman and especially the Greek cultural achievements and the truth of the New World Order, that is, the new Christian civilization for which he, Augustine, was one of the most articulate and influential apologists. Augustine admitted that writers such as Plato were filled with strange fancies contrary to Christian teaching, but he also believed that they wrote much that was in harmony with the faith. In a work called On True Religion, written in about 390, he claimed that Plato, if he was alive in the 4th century, would be a good Christian because Christianity and Platonism shared the same philosophical insights. Such was Augustine's influence that I must put a giant asterisk beside what I said just a few minutes ago about Plato not being known in the medieval Christian West, because, of course, in many ways, Plato's thought, thanks to Augustine, infused Christian thinking. Platonism became part of its DNA. For example, such concepts as the transcendent nature of God, the immortality of the soul, the presence of God in his creation, all of these things were developed or expanded and explained in Christian thought thanks to Augustine's dialogue with Plato and by the influence on him of Plato's writings. It was this kind of pervasive influence that led the great French medievalist Etienne Gilson in 1922 to write about the Middle Ages. Plato himself is nowhere, but Platonism is everywhere. However, many hundreds of years after Augustine, the church authorities were less inclined to accept certain Platonic influences. And in fact, one of the reasons why Plato's works were not translated into Latin during the Middle Ages was because the church actively discouraged it. The first dialogues to be translated in full, the Meno and the Phaedo, were not much studied because of rather glaring theological transgressions. The former assumed the preexistence of the soul before birth, while the latter denied the resurrection of the body. Other of Plato's works alluded to homosexual attachments, and in various dialogues, Socrates boasted that since childhood he had paid heed to the voice of a daemon, a claim that resulted in his trial on a charge of worshiping new deities and his subsequent appointment with a cup of hemlock. Bruni, in the first decades of the 1400s, eventually began to have his own doubts about Plato. He came to regard him as a dangerous thinker, someone who espoused, as he wrote, opinions utterly abhorrent to our customs and ways of living. Bruni's major problem was with the Republic, especially with the proposal put forth in Book 5 that women shall all be the common property of all the men. None shall live with any man privately. Their children, too, shall be held in common, and no parent will know his or her offspring, nor any child his or her parent. Bruni had criticized Chrysoloras' translation of Plato's Republic as inept, and so he was asked to produce a version of his own, but he refused flat out to do so, claiming that the text contained too many ideas that were repellent to Western morals. So it looked as though Plato was due to slip back, even get pushed back into the philosophical shadows. But soon another champion appeared, once again in Florence, someone who was even more eminent and more powerful than Bruni. Once again, the impetus for a Plato revival was the military and political problem, really by now an existential problem in the Byzantine Empire. Constantinople was yet again under threat from the Ottoman Turks, and so efforts were made to bring the Latin West and the Greek East back together to unite the two churches divided since 1054 and to have the princes and bishops and captains of the Latin West band together and as brothers in arms help defeat the Ottomans. To this end, in 1439, a summit with delegations from both the Greek and Latin churches came to Florence, the famous Council of Florence. There was therefore a huge influx of Greek scholars from Constantinople and other points east, bearded magi-like figures who came with thick manuscripts they would use to hammer out church doctrine. One of the men in the Byzantine delegation was a famous Plato scholar, a man named George Gemistos. His passion for Plato was such that he'd even tinkered with his name, turning his surname, Gemistos means full, into its synonym, a name that sounded pleasingly like Plato, and so he became Platho. And in fact, he seemed to be Plato reborn, a kind of time traveler from the golden age of Athens. Gemistos had founded a philosophical school in the Byzantine city of Mistras, and he continued his teaching in Florence in 1439, offering private lectures on Plato to the many interested parties in Florence. Crucially, he came to Florence with a manuscript of the complete works of Plato, in Greek, of course. This treasure caught the attention of the man who funded the arrival of the Greek delegation to Florence, the man who paid all of its bills, the man who brought the council to town in the first place, Cosimo de' Medici, the wealthy Florentine banker and businessman, the wealthiest man in Europe, who for the previous 5 years, since 1434, had been the de facto ruler of the Florentine Republic. Cosimo was a generous patron of the arts, and he was also a great book collector. And in 1439, at the Council of Florence, he acquired the Plato manuscript from Gemistos. He then bided his time until he could find a translator for it. In fact, he would bide his time for more than 20 years, until the early 1460s, almost to the end of his life. He died in 1464. He could read Latin, but not Greek. And so he owned this great prize that, to quote Petrarch, he was deaf to and that was mute to him. It's unclear quite why he waited so long to have it translated, but he may have had the same sorts of moral reservations as Bruni, and indeed many others, the kind of Plato panic that often shook the resolve of Christian scholars. For example, a professor of Greek in Florence, one of the successors of Chrysoloras, was a man named George of Trebizond. Like Bruni, George had worked on translations of Plato only to turn away in disgust. A reading of the Gorgias convinced him that Plato was an enemy of all good things, a monster of ingratitude, impudence, and wicked impiety. He wrote a treatise in which he claimed that Plato was responsible for the fall of the Roman Empire. It collapsed, he said, due to depraved Platonic hedonism. Further, George claimed that Plato was behind all the heresies within the church, as well as being responsible for the rise of Islam. He called the prophet Muhammad a second Plato, claiming that Muhammad had been contaminated with Plato's perverse philosophy by a rogue monk who got himself kicked out of Alexandria because of his unwholesome passion for Platonic philosophy. All of this is absolutely bonkers, of course, but this was the sort of response that Plato still got, the sort of passion he still aroused in the middle of the 1400s. He was regarded by some as a dangerous figure who could undermine Western civilization. So the Plato Renaissance appeared to be misfiring, but finally, in the early 1460s, it looked like the philosopher's moment had come when Cosimo found a translator for his complete works of Plato, and that was a young Florentine scholar named Marsilio Ficino. Ficino was a true Renaissance man. Besides a brilliant philosopher in his own right, he was a doctor, a poet, musician, singer, linguist, astrologer, mathematician, botanist. He was also, we might say, a psychologist or psychiatrist, someone interested in wellness. He suffered badly from depression and therefore, in a book called De Vita, came up with a collection of dietary, pharmacological, astrological, and philosophical ideas about how to combat melancholy. It was a kind of self-help book, Renaissance style. In short, Ficino was one of those dazzlingly brilliant figures that 15th century Florence seemed effortlessly able to produce. As a young man studying medicine in Florence, Ficino read Bruni's translations of Plato and found the philosophy liberal and pleasant and worthy of a learned and noble man. And so the better to study him, he learned Greek. He had a few wobbles about studying a pagan philosopher, the usual Plato panic, not least because Ficino was devoutly Christian and ultimately became ordained as a priest. But then someone pressed into his hands a work by Thomas Aquinas, and he realized that his destiny was to do for Plato what Aquinas had done for Aristotle, that is, to harmonize him with Christian thought, to show that what Augustine and others had claimed was true, that Plato anticipated the truths of revealed religion, and that there was no real conflict between them. In 1462, Cosimo finally commissioned Ficino to translate his Plato manuscript into Latin. He handed over the manuscript and sweetened the deal by throwing in a little country house at Des Res in Careggi, close by the lavish country villa that Cosimo himself owned. After 2 years of work, Ficino translated 10 of the dialogues, and in late July in 1464, Cosimo, knowing his death was approaching, urged Ficino to come visit him at his own villa in Careggi and to bring with him his newly translated manuscripts. Over the next few days, Ficino read Plato aloud to him from various of his new translations, and, if we believe Ficino, Cosimo passed away on August the 1st, 1464, with Ficino by his side reading to him from Plato. Marsilio Ficino is the crucial figure in the Plato Revival. Following Cosimo's death, he completed his translations of all the dialogues along with commentaries on them, and he also published them in a printed book, because, of course, the printing press was available to him by this time. He published them in 1484, a complete edition in Latin of the works of Plato. Besides publication, Ficino did a lot of what we might call publicity to spread knowledge of Plato far and wide. He became, we might say, Plato's apostle on earth. He gave speeches, readings, and lectures on Plato, and most famously, he hosted informal gatherings of students and other interested parties in a kind of Plato book club, almost a Plato fan club. Ficino would address his fellow attendees as beloved in Plato. Plato's works would be read aloud, speeches would be made, and Ficino even threw a birthday party for his hero, here imagined in the 19th century by the Italian painter Luigi Mussini, who shows Ficino declaiming a Platonic passage while Lorenzo de' Medici, seated to his right in his impressive red robe, and a bust of Plato to his left wearing a garland, look on. So Plato had finally and definitively returned. He was present at last, ready to take his place at the center of philosophy, culture, and learning, and also ultimately of the arts, because all of this promotion influenced not only philosophy and theology, but likewise art and literature. Philosophers such as Ficino and another Neoplatonist, his friend Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, rubbed shoulders with poets such as Angelo Poliziano, and they, including Poliziano, also came into contact, because Florence was a small town, with artists such as Michelangelo and Sandro Botticelli. And of course, these artists became enthused by and infused with Platonic ideas. But that is another story. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe to my channel, watch my other videos, and even if you want more information on Ficino, on Plato, on Cosimo de' Medici, on the Florentine Renaissance, or even on George of Trebizond's wacky conspiracy theories, please seriously consider buying my latest book, The Bookseller of Florence. I leave you with the words of the great protagonist of The Bookseller of Florence, Vespasiano da Bisticci. All evil is born from ignorance, yet writers have illuminated the world, chasing away the darkness.